And welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today I'll be talking about how our progress toward living a better life is in a way at the same time linear and circular or cyclical. You might remember what I've been trying to do lately is try to mine some of the meaning out of this beautiful and really kind of wondrous myth Socrates tells in the Phaedrus about the soul, or if you like, human consciousness, and about how it falls from its primal state of purity and oneness in this myth to a state in which it is in this habit of seeking autonomy for itself by creating objects for itself here in this world of embodiment, embodied existence. And we saw how in this myth, the soul, in this fallen state, retains a buried memory of the absolute beauty it saw in its former life. We found, or at least I opined, that this account, on the one hand, couldn't be simply reduced to a Freudian interpretation of unconscious memory of infantile mental life. But on the other hand, that this Freudian concept of infantile mental life in which there's no real boundary between self and other shouldn't be entirely rejected either, because it shed, at least I felt, some light on Socrates' myth. Anyway, having, in my view, dealt with that, we then ended up wondering if we were unfaithful to Socrates' myth because we found ourselves imagining human consciousness progressing over time to a higher unity than the one it experienced in these very early stages of its existence as a baby or earlier. Whereas the myth, on the other hand, depicts souls unconsciously yearning to return to their original state, than which nothing could be higher or purer or more blissful. And they have everything in this state, whereas unlike infants that haven't yet developed what seems to be this essential aspect of human being, which is reason. And there's actually something else that might have raised a question for us. Aren't autonomy and objectification essential to human consciousness? Aren't these part of what it is to be human? And isn't to make objects and objectives for ourselves, to seek autonomy, if you like, to boldly go where no one has gone before, aren't these the distinctly and essentially human glory? Whereas in this Platonic myth, the search for autonomy is a kind of fall. Anyway, I think there's a way to reconcile these seeming inconsistencies in our interpretation in a way that helps point us to a better life, and I'd like to talk about that today. One thing that comes to my mind, actually, in this connection is the fact that there's always something new about going home. When we return to what we think is the same, we find there's always something different, and it's perhaps this fusion of sameness and novelty that can make homecoming kind of psychically poignant or potent or pregnant. A sense that this melding of old and new has a hidden message for us, that maybe even in some way it's full of life, that is in some way telling the story of life, or trying to. And I think we see this in some of the great stories of homecoming. The story of the prodigal son that we find in the Christian Gospel of St. Luke, for example, the climax, the moment of greatest stress and greatest catharsis, is in the homecoming, when we see the beautiful and wondrous joy of the Father in the Son's return. The great advance of the narrative begins in the Son's turning back. The nostos, or homecoming of the hero, is also the most important part, actually, of Homer's Odyssey, whereas Odysseus' account of his travels, which I think in popular culture, is often what most people think of the core or essential part of the Odyssey. These tales, for example, of Circe turning his crew into animals, and the encounters with the Cyclops and Scylla and Charybdis and so on. Actually, all these things take up only 4 of the epic's 24 books. But the story of his return home, and if you include his restoration of his home to himself, his defeat of the suitors, that takes up 12 books, about half of the epic. And it's only once he's home that Odysseus is able to resolve what you could say is a central problem of the epic, the wrath he had incurred of Poseidon, which is responsible for his endless catastrophes. It's only at the end that he's able to appease Poseidon and make peace with the sea god. A central and crucial aspect of the philosophy of Plato, I think at least implied in the dialogues and then made explicit in the Neoplatonic tradition, could present us with an explanation of why homecoming seems somehow so psychically rich to us, and of why it seems to figure so prominently in the world's stories. And that is that it's based in what you could call the fundamental structure or pattern of being itself. Reality is cyclical, or perhaps you could say it's at once linear and cyclical. Of course, the linear structure of reality is what you could call the everyday. First one thing happens, then another, and they sort of form this line of events, and it's due to time, or perhaps you could say this linear structure is really the same thing as time. But the Platonic tradition lays a cyclical structure that is outside time and space, in a way, alongside this one. You can at least infer this, I think, from the theory of the forms that's outlined in the dialogues. If forms are the essences of things, they must fully contain things. You could infer they must not just represent a moment of them like a sort of snapshot. The form of something must explain or contain what a thing does over the course of its life. It's as though the form of something really is its destiny. So, for example, the Platonic form of oak must include within it not just the idea of the mature oak tree, but the idea of the acorn and of the whole process by which acorn becomes oak and produces new acorns and also passes away. And Plato also says that forms act on things by those things participating in them. A chair has chairness by participating in the idea of the chair. For this to happen not just statically, sort of snapshot-wise, but dynamically over the life of the chair must participate in chairness at every instant of its life. It must be in a constant process of referring back to its form, if you like, of going out of its form into the spatio-temporal world, being an actual sensible chair, and of returning to its idea to participate in it, so that its idea guides it. I think you could say then that the form of something, as I said, is its destiny, and that the cosmos works through this constant process of things going out into the world from their ideas, the destiny or truth of themselves, and returning or referring to them to be guided and shaped by them. This is how their ideas, their destinies, work themselves out through them. This cyclical structure of being is made more explicit in the Neoplatonists, Plotinus, for example, but I think most remarkably and most explicitly of all, Proclus, who lived in the 5th century AD. And Proclus, by the way, is a very interesting character for a number of reasons, among them that he practiced a kind of eclectic polytheism, sometimes at considerable personal risk, at a time when the Roman Empire had been officially Christian for some time. And the ultimate source and destination of all things in this, according to this tradition, that from which everything proceeds and everything departs, to which everything returns, is of course the one or good. So, what does this idea have to do with Plato's myth of the soul? I think it can help us better understand the myth and see how our own interpretation aligns with it. The psyche is no different from other things in this respect. Its life is also both linear and circular. Since return, for the Platonists, the truth of its life is really in the circular. Since return is the way things are themselves, the way they realize their potential, we humans realize our potential or ideal or destiny by looking back to it. And when we cease to do this, we disintegrate psychically. When we cease to look back to the one, or everything as one, or you could say destiny. That progress to a higher consciousness than we have had before can be, actually must be, also understood as a return, because it requires the psyche to constantly refer back to its principle, the good or one, because to have this higher consciousness is to understand things. To have this higher consciousness is to understand things in their causes, which is to understand them in their unity and their goodness. The intellect looks back to the one or good to make progress, because it must always be referring itself back to truth, the good of intellect. And the truth of things is, of course, the unity of things. I mean, the truth of things is not things in isolation one from another, one quality abstracted from something, but it is in things all together as one. As is often the case, I think, Plotinus helps us understand Plato here. Toward the end of his Enneads, he writes about this process of the mind referring to or returning to its principle, the one and good, to realize itself, to, in a way, be with itself, at home with itself. He writes, quote, "The best intellect, that is, the one that does not look outside itself, necessarily thinks what is prior to itself. For in reverting to itself, it reverts to its origin. It will be looking completely to what is better than and prior to itself, the good or one. On the one hand, it is present to the good, that which is first, and looks to it. And on the other, it is together with itself." For this tradition, consciousness that really progresses, that goes forward, that actualizes itself, is simultaneously living cyclically, because the life of progress is a life of remembering, of constant turning back or conversion to the one or good. And probably here I read into Plato and Plotinus more than they intended, at least consciously. But perhaps what's going on here is the psyche is capable of in some way calling up that buried memory of the absolute unity it knew as an infant or earlier, as a kind of window into the absolute unity of all things. Anyway, Plotinus is fond of using this image of the center of a circle as that principle of the psyche that it somehow returns to in memory. Principle of the psyche and principle of everything, which Plato had depicted in his myth as heaven and the place beyond it. And Plotinus writes, "If then a soul knows itself as it was at another time, it knows also that its motion is not straight, but that, other than when it is deflected, that's to say, when it forgets the one or good, and takes on a purely self-other relationship, lives purely in a world of objects for itself. So other than that, other than when it is deflected, its natural motion is like that in a circle, not around something external, but about its own center. And then he says what we quoted him as saying last time about the same center, the one or good, being not just the center of the self, but the center of all things. Realizing our potential in the Platonic tradition is the bringing of this inkling of absolute goodness or unity as principle of everything to consciousness. Plotinus says again, while we are always around it, we do not always look to it. So it's always affecting us, even if we're not aware of it. And he says a little later, we are like a chorus that, singing all the while related to the chorus leader, may turn outwards from the spectacle, but when it does turn towards it, the chorus sings beautifully and does in truth relate to the chorus leader. So too, we are always around it. When we look towards it, that is, and he quotes, this phrase is from Plato's Republic, journey's end and rest. That is journey's end and rest for us, and the end of discordance for us, dancing round it, a divinely inspired dance. And within this circling dance, behold, the fount of life, the fount of intellect, the principle of being, the cause of goodness, the root of soul. For we are not cut off, not separated. We breathe, we are preserved, not by it giving and then leaving, but because it always provides for us, as long as it is just what it is. We, however, exist to a greater degree when inclined towards it, and our well-being is there, whereas being distant from it makes us alone and lesser in existence. The fullness of life, our realization as individuals, is through our looking back to our principle then. And so it's precisely by returning that we, you could say, boldly go where no one has gone before. And so once again, it's precisely by returning that we realize ourselves in the most individual way. And so once again, I find it apt to cite some lines from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And a little later it goes, with the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. So this voyage of returning, this voyage of going out and coming back is basically the itinerary that Plato traces out for the best life. But you've read or have been reading, if you've read or have been reading the Phaedrus and his other works, you'll know there's something important in this connection that we haven't really touched on here, and that is that Plato seems to be saying that this is a life that only a few can live. This is the life of the philosopher only, he says. And we might remember in this connection that none of Odysseus's crew made it home with him. They were all lost in the voyage. And so is Plato saying that this life is only for a kind of spiritual elite? I think in our humanistic age, it'd be hard for most of us not to find this kind of fatalistic, depressing, and perhaps even offensive. I think it's worth exploring, actually, to what extent this is true of Plato and to what extent it goes with his principles. And that's what I'd like to talk about next time. Anyway, I hope you can join me then. And until then, be well. And thanks again for watching.